Hans Peter Mack was scheduled to meet with his wife on July 4th, 2023 for their lunch date. However, Hans would never show up. His Mercedes-Benz would be found abandoned in a parking lot in Pattaya, just south of Thailand's capital city, Bangkok. And 2 weeks later, in a rented home in southern Thailand, authorities would discover the horrifying truth behind the German businessman's disappearance. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Crime Corner with Jen, and for those of you who don't know, my name is Jen and I talk about true crime cases on this channel. Before we jump into today's story, please be sure to like, subscribe, and to turn on the notification bell so that you don't miss out on any of my future uploads. This case takes place in Thailand, which is where I'm living, and also happened in a city that's maybe about an hour or an hour and a half from where I'm currently located. So when I heard about this case, I knew immediately that I wanted to share it with you guys, just because it's not often that there's many cases from Thailand that I'm able to talk about and share on my YouTube. Today's story begins on July 4th, 2023, when a German man by the name of Hans Peter Mack was scheduled to meet with his wife, Biraya, for their lunch date. Now, when Hans failed to show up for their lunch date at the scheduled time, Biraya would decide to give him a call and found it really strange that her call went straight to voicemail. A few minutes after she had tried calling Hans and he didn't pick up, she would receive a text message from him saying that he would call her back. And then moments after that, Biraya would start receiving a string of text messages that just didn't sound like they were coming from her husband. This began to set off a number of alarms in her head because you see, Biraya and Hans have been together or married, maybe not married for 5 years, but they've been together for 5 years. And not once throughout their 5-year relationship has Hans ever texted her. If they needed to talk to each other about something and they weren't together and they needed to communicate, then they would just pick up the phone and communicate via verbal communication on the phone. She suspected that maybe somebody had taken Hans' phone because even the way that the messages were written, it just didn't sound like the way her husband would speak. Later that evening, when her husband still hadn't come home and she still isn't able to get in touch with him, she's now sure that something's happened to her husband. Biraya and her family would quickly make their way over to the police station on that same evening, and they would put up a missing persons notice. On the missing persons notice, they would offer a 3 million baht reward for anyone who could share information about Hans's whereabouts. And 3 million baht, that's a lot of money, especially in Thailand. It's actually the equivalent of $87,500. According to the missing persons notice, Hans was last spotted by CCTV on July 4th at around 12:42 p.m. on Chayapruk Road in Pattaya. Later in the week, on a Sunday, the authorities would also confirm that they had found Hans's missing vehicle, so his Mercedes-Benz. It had been left parked and abandoned in a parking lot of an apartment complex in Nong Pru, Chonburi. Just as a side note, Chonburi is a province in southern Thailand and is home to the city of Pattaya. For those of you in the States, think of Chonburi as a very, very small state, and then think of Pattaya as the city in that state. So when the police found the missing vehicle, they immediately started checking the vehicle in and out for any clues about what could have happened to Hans. And they would discover that within the car, it had been scrubbed clean. Somebody had taken some cleaning solvent and had scrubbed the interior of the car absolutely clean, as if they were trying to hide some traces of DNA, or not hide, but erase any traces of DNA or evidence. Inside the car, the authorities would also find a cordless chainsaw, as well as hedge clippers and rolls of plastic wrap. Now, around the same period of when authorities discovered or found Hans's missing vehicle, they would also receive a call from a Thai couple who would tell them that they had been hired by a German woman to deliver a freezer to a pool villa in Chayapruk Soi 1. Now, let me just quickly explain for those of you who are not familiar with Thailand and how our streets work. Chayapruk is the road, in Pattaya, so it's like a big road on Pattaya. And then when I'm referring to alleys or sois, as that's what we call them in Thailand, I'm referring to smaller roads that are off of the main road. So there's usually like alley 1, alley 2, alley 3, alley 4, and they go down to like, I don't know, 100, depending on the road. So the pool villa that the Thai couple were talking about here was located off of Chayapruk Road in alley 1. The Thai couple who submitted the tip did ask to remain anonymous, and I don't believe they shared tons of information with the authorities just because they were only hired to drop off the freezer at this pool villa. They weren't really involved with the case or anything else. They were just hired to do something. They did that something. Although I do suspect that when they saw the missing persons notice, they kind of put 2 and 2 together. Here they have a German man who's been missing, was last seen in that area, and they remember that on the same day, they had delivered a freezer to a German woman in that same area, and they probably just put 2 and 2 together and thought maybe it was a little bit suspicious, and they ended up being good Samaritans by reaching out to the police and sharing with the officers what they knew. Shortly after receiving that tip from the Thai couple, the investigators would go ahead and check CCTV footage around the Chayapruk Road, specifically around Soi 1, 2, and 3. And what they found captured on the footage was pretty interesting. Footage from the cameras would capture a utility truck driving out of a pool villa in Chayapruk Soi 1. This truck was driven by a male foreigner, and in the back of the truck was the same freezer that the Thai couple had dropped off at that villa. The freezer had been strapped to the back of the truck with plastic sheets or plastic wrap, as well as black tape. Now, don't forget that in Hans's car, when the investigators found it, they also found rolls of plastic wrap. Now, could it all be some sort of coincidence? Because I think not. Apparently, the utility truck had driven around randomly for 144 kilometers in Chonburi. The truck eventually did stop and park at a place called Chokchai Garden Home 1. Now, it only takes about 15 or maybe 20 minutes max to get from Chayapruk Soi 1 to Chokchai Garden Home. So my theory here is that whoever was driving that utility truck was trying to cover his tracks. Maybe they knew about the CCTV cameras around those roads, and they were just trying to make it seem like they were going much further than they actually were. While this may have bought the driver a little bit more time in the investigation, the ruse didn't work. Investigators were soon able to trace the vehicle to Chokchai Garden Home 1. On Monday, July 10th, the authorities would be granted a search warrant from the Pattaya Provincial Court, and they would take this warrant to a 35-year-old housekeeper who was managing the home. The housekeeper would tell the authorities that the home had been rented out to a few foreigners for about a year now, and they've always paid their rent on time and have never really caused her any issues or trouble. So she was really surprised to hear that the authorities believed that a body might be hidden in that home. Police would enter the home at about 10:45 p.m. on that Monday evening, and they would immediately get started on searching the property. When the authorities made their way into one of the bedrooms within the house, they would discover a freezer that had been sealed with black tape and left running in the bedroom with a coolant inside. The authorities quickly knew that whatever was in that freezer couldn't have been good. But honestly, nothing could have prepared them for the horror that they would find when opening that freezer. The contents of the freezer contained 13 mutilated body parts, including a head. They were immediately able to identify that this person was Hans Peter Mack because, again, the freezer did contain Hans's head, so that did make it a little easier to identify the victim. And on top of the remains was a little tree saw, which the officers suspect may have been used to dismember the victim's body. At 11:30 p.m. that evening, the officers would stand outside the rented home and they would have a press conference essentially, confirming that they had indeed found the body of 62-year-old Hans Peter Mack. Now that Hans's remains have been found and this case is no longer a disappearance case but is now a homicide case, the next step for the investigation is for the officers to find the perpetrators. Searching through CCTV footage, the investigators were able to spot Hans's gray Mercedes-Benz driving along a key intersection on July 4th around noon. In the footage, he was seen driving behind an SUV belonging to a German real estate broker by the name of Petra Grungriff. Hans and Petra had apparently met earlier that day at a coffee shop on Chayapruk Road to discuss some business matters. After their meeting, the pair would get into their separate vehicles and then they would start driving towards the pool villa at Chayapruk Soi 1. And this is where the authorities believe the murder was committed. It's believed that Petra had lured Hans to this villa where two other men were laying in wait to jump him. And once he got to the pool villa, this is when everything went down. The authorities believe that the meeting at the pool villa had been some sort of scheme to extort money from Hans, because Hans was a very wealthy man. He was a very successful businessman and therefore had a lot of money. And since his disappearance, 2 million baht has already been transferred out of his bank account. Now, you're probably thinking 2 million baht is probably not a lot of money in a first world country, but in Thailand, 2 million baht is quite a bit of money. So officers, when they look at that, quickly begin to suspect that that was the reason behind the murder. So it seems that when Hans arrived at the villa, the perpetrators had forced him to transfer his money out of his bank account, and then right after, they would make the decision to get rid of him. Investigators did discover that Hans's head did sustain some sort of blunt trauma or blunt force trauma, so this could very well be the main cause of death. Initially, officers would suspect that 3 German nationals had been involved in the murder, but only 2 would be arrested. They also said they had a 4th suspect who was a non-German national. The 3 German nationals were 54-year-old Petra Grungriff, as well as 52-year-old Olaf Brinkmann and a 52-year-old Nicole Frevel. The 4th suspect was a 27-year-old Pakistani man by the name of Shairuk Karim Uddin, who was living in Thailand with a Thai nationality. All 4 suspects would immediately claim that they had no idea what was going on and they had no involvement in the murder whatsoever. So arrest warrants were issued, but only to 3 of the 4 suspects. On Wednesday, July 12th, Petra, Olaf, and Shahrukh would all be arrested for the murder of Hans Peter Mack. Both Petra and Olaf had actually been questioned on Sunday the 9th, a day before Hans's body was found, but they refused to cooperate with the investigators. And since Hans's body was not yet found at this time, the investigators did have to let them go due to lack of evidence. Nicole was also interrogated by the investigators, but she was only interrogated after Hans's body was discovered. The initial reason that authorities believe that Nicole may have been somehow involved in this case is because she was actually renting the home that Hans's body was found in. It turns out that the other 2 Germans had been subletting this home to Nicole, and she apparently had no idea what was in the freezer when it was dropped off by the male foreigner who had driven the utility truck. So when she saw the police arriving at the home on Monday at her home that she was renting, she panicked. And instead of just speaking to the officers and trying to figure out what was going on, she quickly left the home and made her way over to a coffee shop down the road and hid there. So her actions there are also very suspicious, and I can understand why the officers would suspect her of being involved in this case. However, as I mentioned earlier, she's been interrogated, they've investigated her, and they don't think she was actually involved. So that's kind of that with Nicole. As for Petra and Olaf, in some articles that I found, they were described to be business partners. Also, I did say earlier in my video that the suspects were arrested on a Wednesday. However, that's incorrect. They were actually arrested on Tuesday, the 11th of July. So on Tuesday, 11th of July, both Petra and Olaf would be brought in for questioning. Well, they would be arrested first and then brought in for questioning, and they would go through a 3-hour-long interrogation. When entering the police station, Petra would be asked by a news reporter why she had murdered her German friend. And instead of just ignoring the person who asked her this question and instead of just continuing her walk into the police station, Petra would turn around and react super aggressively. She would lash out at the news reporter and would even knock her cell phone out of her hands. This was really shocking to the poor news girl because you don't do this in Thailand. You do not lash out in public like that in Thailand, or in Asia in general. People don't do this sort of thing. So it was really shocking to see her react that way. And also it shows that Petra has a really bad temper. Olaf, on the other hand, would only be taken in for interrogation hours later, late in the evening on that Tuesday. He wasn't actually even in Pattaya at the time that the police brought him in. He was in Bangkok at some club, so the authorities had to track him down there and then arrest him and then bring him all the way back to Pattaya in order to question him at the Nong Pru police station. Deputy Police Chief General Surashad Hakporn, otherwise known as Big Joke, which is his nickname in Thailand, and no, it's not meant to be offensive. I think he's pretty happy with that nickname, to be honest. He's a really high-ranking official, so he's very well respected, and Big Joke just happens to be his nickname here. Big Joke thinks that Olaf was the mastermind behind this whole crime. The reason for this, we will get into a little bit further in this video, but basically his past and his background, meaning Olaf's past and background, indicate that he's the most likely person to have come up with this whole scheme. Officers were on their way to bring in Shahrukh as well, but Shahrukh somehow managed to escape being taken into custody and instead fled over to a province called Kanchanaburi, which borders Myanmar. He was trying to cross the border to avoid being taken in, but authorities were able to catch him before he was able to head over the border. During the interrogations, all three suspects continued to claim that they had absolutely nothing to do with what happened to Hans. Luckily, sufficient DNA was collected to convict all three for the murder of Hans Peter Mack. All three suspects are currently in police custody, and Olaf is currently the prime suspect in this case. Olaf has also been charged with premeditated murder, which is punishable by death. As for Petra and Shahrukh, the officers are still trying to determine the extent of their involvement in the crime. I believe that charges won't officially be pressed on those two until that investigation has been carried out a little bit more. This case is super recent. It happened about a month ago. So there's still a lot of things that are being investigated and a lot of information that I'm sure will be released in the next few weeks or the next few months. However, I think it's pretty clear here that Olaf is going to be the main focus in the investigation, and let's see what happens with him. Police actually did seize about 2 or so weeks ago, maybe 2.5 weeks ago, a speedboat belonging to Olaf. And they believe that Olaf had purchased the speedboat in order to take Hans's body and dump it into the ocean. On top of that, do you guys remember the electric saw that I told you guys about that was found in Hans's car? Well, the owner of the store that sells that saw has confirmed in a testimony that he did in fact sell that saw to Olaf. So I guess you can say that the evidence here is stacked up pretty high against Olaf. Before we wrap up this video, I just want to quickly talk about the suspects. For one, I want to start with Shahrukh. Shahrukh, to this day, still pleads innocent. He claims that he was forced to cooperate in the transfer of Hans's body from the pool villa to the rented home in Chok Chai by Olaf. According to Shahrukh, Olaf had threatened Shahrukh's life with his head and then told him that if he refused to move the body from the pool villa to the Chokchai rented home, then he would find his sister and the rest of his family members and his wife as well, and he would murder them. Shahrukh was adamant that he wasn't involved in Hans's murder, but he did comply in the transfer of the body, and he only did so because he was forced to. Do I believe Shahrukh? I actually do. I actually do believe that he likely did not kill Hans, and that he was likely threatened and coerced into transporting Hans' body from one place to another. But I don't believe that he's guilty of the murder itself. Olaf seems to be a very threatening man, and he's part of a very, very shady group of people, so I can see why Shahrukh was so scared of him, and I can totally see Olaf being someone that is likely to threaten somebody to get what he wants. It's also been revealed that both Olaf and Petra have had very interesting criminal histories. Petra has only been in Thailand for about 5 years, and she only moved here because she was about to be arrested by German police for being involved in a number of petty thefts and scams. As for Olaf, he's a gang leader of a motorcycle gang in Thailand that partakes in a number of criminal dealings. So when I say I believe Shahrukh about the whole being forced to cooperate in this entire ordeal, I believe it, because Olaf is not the most stand-up guy. He's definitely a very shady and very potentially dangerous man. Now, from what I've heard from sources in my personal life, it seems that all 3 of these German nationals were involved in some shady dealings, including the victim. In 2018, Hans was in quite a bit of hot water for charges related to trafficking minors. During the investigation of his disappearance, when his family members were speaking to press, one news reporter did ask his family about these charges and asked if maybe his disappearance had anything to do with the charges. And his family would tell the news reporter that, oh no, it was all a misunderstanding. Let's all just forget about that and focus on finding Hans. So fair enough. I understand that they didn't want to be addressing those topics at that time, and they just wanted to find their loved one. So that's totally fine. But that's another red flag. How can you be charged with something if you weren't in some way involved? That's all I've got to say about it. I also just want to quickly clarify that even if Hans was involved in some shady business deals, I definitely do not think that he deserved to be murdered. So I don't want that to take away from the case and the murder itself, because what happened to Hans was absolutely horrifying. I feel terrible for his family. I feel terrible for him. No one should ever leave the world in the way that he did. So in light of all this information about all 3 German nationals participating in shady business dealings, I do wonder whether this crime was purely an attempt to extort Hans's money, or if it perhaps had to do with some sort of business deal gone sour. Again, only 2 million baht was taken from Hans's account, and that's the equivalent of $58,000. Yes, that is a lot of money, but who would murder somebody just to take 58,000 US dollars? There's never a good reason to murder anybody, but especially not for $58,000. Especially considering this man had a wealth of funds. This man had properties all over Thailand, especially on beautiful islands, and owned yachts. And yet they only took 2 million baht, which is 58,000 US dollars from him, despite him having all of these things and all of this wealth. I don't know, something about it just does not make sense to me. And also, don't forget that on the day of the murder, Hans, and Petra had met to discuss business. So this proves that they were somehow working together on a business deal. So is it really far-fetched to believe that maybe they were working together and things turned sour and both Olaf and Petra decided to get rid of him because of that? That would make the most sense to me, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. As I mentioned, this is still ongoing, so there's going to be more information coming out in the next few weeks or in the next few months or however long this investigation takes. So I'm very curious to see if Thailand's actually going to go ahead with the death sentence. I don't actually believe many people get sentenced to death here. So I'm very curious to know if that's actually going to be happening, but that really just depends if the charges go through for Olaf on that. And I am very curious to know what's going to happen to Shahrukh and Petra. I really honestly don't believe that Shahrukh is guilty of the murder. I don't believe that he participated in any of it through his own free will. So I do hope that he can get some sort of justice for what's happened to him as well. And I also hope that Hans is able to get the justice he deserves, because despite what he had going on in the background, I definitely don't believe anyone should be murdered like this. It's horrifying, and it's horrifying to his family. So I will keep you guys updated on any new updates on the case through my Twitter. I have a Twitter now. So yeah, please follow me on my Twitter. I'm going to put it up somewhere here. And I'm going to be uploading case updates and just updates in general on that for this channel. So please stay tuned to that. And again, if you guys have any case recommendations, please shoot them through to truecrimebygenta@gmail.com. And don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. And until next time, stay curious and stay safe. Bye.